Good morning, friends. And may my compassionate reader now have mercy on me. Until now my pen sped on untrembling, my heart didn't skip a beat, and we slipped along unconcerned, because for these 15 years we have been firmly protected either by legal revolutionality or else by revolutionary legality. But from now on things will be painful, as the reader will recollect, as we have had explained to us dozens of times, beginning with Khrushchev. From approximately 1934, violations of Leninist norms of legality began. And how are we to enter this abyss of illegality now? How are we to drag our way along yet another bitter stretch of road? However, these trials which follow were because of the fame of the defendants, a cynosure of the whole world. They did not escape the attention of the public. They were written about. They were interpreted, and they will be interpreted again and again. It is for us merely to touch lightly on their riddle. Let us make one qualification, though not a big one. The published stenographic records did not coincide completely with what was said at the trials. One writer, who received an entrance pass, they were given out only to selected individuals, took running notes, and subsequently discovered these differences. All the correspondents also noted the snag with Krestinsky, which made a recess necessary in order to get him back on the track of his assigned testimony. Here's how I picture it. Before the trial, a chart was set up for emergencies. In the first column was the name of the defendant, in the second the method to be used during the recess if he should depart from his text during the open trial. In the third column, the name of the Chekist responsible for applying the indicated method. So if Krestinsky departed from his text, then who would come on the run, and what that person would do had already been arranged. But the inaccuracies of the stenographic record did not change or lighten the picture. Dumbfounded, the whole world watched 3 plays in a row, 3 wide-ranging and expansive dramatic productions in which the powerful leaders of the fearless Communist Party, who had turned the entire world upside down and terrified it, now marched forth like doleful, obedient goats and bleated out everything they had been ordered to, vomited all over themselves, cringingly abased themselves in their convictions, and confessed to crimes that they could not in any wise have committed. This was unprecedented in remembered history. It was particularly astonishing in contrast with the recent Leipzig trial of Dimitrov. Dimitrov had answered the Nazi judges like a roaring lion, and immediately afterward his comrades in Moscow, members of that same unyielding cohort which had made the whole world tremble, and the greatest of them at that, those who had been called the Leninist Guard, came before the judges drenched in their own urine. And even though much appears to have been clarified since then, with particular success by Arthur Koestler, the riddle continues to circulate as durably as ever. People have speculated about a Tibetan potion that deprives a man of his will, and about the use of hypnosis. Such explanations must by no means be rejected. If the NKVD possessed such methods, clearly there were no moral rules to prevent resorting to them. Why not weaken or muddle the will? And it is a known fact that in the 1920s some leading hypnotists gave up their careers and entered service of the GPU. It is also reliably known that in the 1930s a school of hypnotists existed in the NKVD. Kamenov's wife was allowed to visit her husband before his trial and found him not himself, his reactions retarded, and she managed to communicate this to others before she herself was arrested. But why was neither Polchinsky nor Khrennikov broken by the Tibetan potion or hypnosis? The fact is that an explanation on a higher psychological plane is called for. One misunderstanding in particular results from the image of these men as old revolutionaries who had not trembled in Tsarist dungeons, seasoned, tried and true, hardened, etc., fighters. But there is a plain and simple mistake here. These defendants were not those old revolutionaries. They had acquired that glory by inheritance from an association with the Narodniks, the SRs, and the anarchists. They were the ones, the bomb-throwers and the conspirators, who had known hard labor, imprisonment, and real prison terms. But even they had never in their lives experienced a genuinely merciless interrogation, because such a thing did not exist at all in Tsarist Russia. And these others, the Bolshevik defendants at the treason trials, had never known either interrogation or real prison terms. The Bolsheviks had never been sentenced to special dungeons, any Sakhalin, any special hard labor in Yakutsk. It is well known that Dzerzhinsky, at the hardest times of them all, that he had spent all his life in prisons, but according to our yardstick he had served just a normal tenor, just a simple 10-ruble bill. Like any ordinary collective farmer in our time. True, included in that tenor were 3 years in the hard labor central prison, but that is nothing special either. The party leaders, who were the defendants in the trials of 1936-38, had in their revolutionary past known short, easy imprisonment, short periods in exile, had never even had a whiff of hard labor. Bucharin had many petty arrests on his record, and they amounted to nothing. Apparently he was never imprisoned anywhere for a whole year at a time, and he had just a wee bit of exile in Onega. Kamenev, despite long years of propaganda work and travel to all the cities of Russia, spent only 2 years in prison and 1.5 years in exile. In our time, even 16-year-old kids got 5 right off. Zinoviev, believe it or not, never spent as much as 3 months in prison. He never received even 1 sentence. In comparison with the ordinary natives of our archipelago, they were all callow youths. They didn't know what prison was like. Rykov and Ian Smirnov had been arrested several times and had been imprisoned for 5 years, but somehow they went through prison very easily, and they either escaped from exile without any trouble at all, or were released because of an amnesty. Until they were arrested and imprisoned in the Lubyanka, they hadn't the slightest idea what a real prison was, nor what the jaws of unjust interrogation were like. There is no basis for assuming that if Trotsky had fallen into those jaws, he would have conducted himself with any less self-abasement, or that his resistance would have proved stronger than theirs. He had had no occasion to prove it. He, too, had known only easy imprisonment, no serious interrogations, and a mere 2 years of exile in Ust-Kut. The terror Trotsky inspired as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council was something he acquired very cheaply, and does not at all demonstrate any true strength of character or courage. Those who have condemned many others to be shot often wilt at the prospect of their own death. The two kinds of toughness are not connected. And as for Radek, he was a plain provocateur. And he wasn't the only one in these 3 trials, and Yagoda was an inveterate habitual criminal. This murderer of millions simply could not imagine that his superior murderer up top would not, at the last moment, stand up for him and protect him. Just as though Stalin had been sitting right there in the hall, Yagoda confidently and insistently begged him directly for mercy. "I appeal to you. For you I built 2 great canals." And a witness reports that at just that moment a match flared in the shadows behind a window on the 2nd floor of the hall, apparently behind a muslin curtain. And while it lasted, the outline of a pipe could be seen. Whoever has been in Bakhchurisy may remember that oriental trick. The 2nd floor windows in the Hall of Sessions and the State Council are covered with iron sheets, pierced by small holes, and behind them is an unlit gallery. It is never possible to guess down in the hall itself whether someone is up there or not. The Khan remained invisible, and the council always met as if in his presence. Given Stalin's out-and-out oriental character, I can readily believe that he watched the comedies in that October hall. I cannot imagine that he would have denied himself this spectacle, this satisfaction. And after all, our entire failure to understand derives from our belief in the unusual nature of these people. We did not, after all, where ordinary confessions signed by ordinary citizens are concerned, find their reasons for denouncing themselves and others so fulsomely baffling. We accept it as something we understand. A human being is weak. A human being gives in. But we consider Bucharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Pyadekev, Ian Smirnov to be supermen to begin with, and in essence our failure to understand is due to that fact alone. True, the directors of this dramatic production seem to have had a harder task in selecting the performers than they'd had in the earlier trials of the engineers. In those trials they had 40 barrels to pick from, so to speak, whereas here the available troupe was small. Everyone knew who the chief performers were, and the audience wanted to see them in the roles and them only. Yet there was a choice. The most far-sighted and determined of those who were doomed did not allow themselves to be arrested. They committed suicide first. Skripnik, Tomsky, Gimmernik. It was the ones who wanted to live who allowed themselves to be arrested, and one could certainly braid a rope from the ones who wanted to live, but even among them some behaved differently. During the interrogations, realized what was happening, turned stubborn, and died silently, but at least not shamefully. For some reason, they did not, after all, put on public trial Rudzatok, Postyachev, Yanudkids, Chuber, Koiser, and for that matter, Krylenko himself, even though their names would have embellished the trials. They put on trial the most compliant. A selection was made after all. The men selected were drawn from a lower order, but on the other hand, the mustached producer knew each of them very well. He also knew that on the whole they were weaklings, and he knew one by one the particular weaknesses of each. Therein lay his dark and special talent, his main psychological bent in his life's achievement, to see people's weaknesses on the lowest plane of being. And the man who seems, in the perspective of time, to have embodied the highest and brightest intelligence of all the disgraced and executed leaders, and to whom Arthur Koestler apparently dedicated his talented inquiry, the N.I. Bukharin, Stalin saw through him, too, at that lowest stratum at which the human being unites with the earth, and Stalin held him in a long death grip, playing with him as a cat plays with a mouse, letting him go just a little and then catching him again. Bukharin wrote every last word of our entire existing, in other words, non-existent constitution, which is so beautiful to listen to, and he flew about up there, just below the clouds, and thought that he had outplayed Koba, that he had thrust a constitution on him and would compel him to relax the dictatorship. And at the very moment he himself had already been caught in those jaws. Bukharin did not like Kamenov and Zinoviev. And way back when they had first been tried after the murder of Kirov, he had said to people close to him, well, so what? That's the kind of people they were. Maybe there was something to it. That was the classic formula of the Philistine in those years. There was probably something to it. In our country, they don't arrest people for nothing, and that was said in 1935 to the leading theoretician of the party. He spent the period of the second trial of Kamenov and Zinoviev in the summer of 1936 hunting in the Tian Shan and knew nothing about it. He came down from the mountain of Frunes, and there he read that the death sentence had been imposed on both men, and read the newspaper articles which made clear what annihilating testimony they had given against him. But did he hasten to stop that act of repression? And did he protest to the party that something monstrous was being done? No. All he did was send Koba a telegram asking him to postpone the execution of Kamenov and Zinoviev so that he, Bukharin, could get there to confront them and prove himself innocent. It was too late. Koba had enough of the sworn testimony. Why did he need living confrontations? However, they still didn't arrest Bukharin for a long time. He lost his job as editor-in-chief of Izvestaya and all his other party assignments and jobs, and he lived for half a year in his Kremlin apartment, in the Poteshny Palace of Peter the Great, as if in prison. However, in the autumn he used to go to his dacha, and the Kremlin guards would salute him as though nothing at all had changed. No one visited him or phoned him any longer, and all during these months he wrote endless letters, "Dear Koba, dear Koba, dear Koba." But he got one reply. He got not one reply. He was still trying to establish friendly contact with Stalin, and dear Koba, squinting, was already staging rehearsals. For many long years Koba had been holding tryouts for various roles, and he knew that Bukharchik would play his part beautifully. He had, after all, already renounced those of his pupils and supporters who had been arrested and exiled, and they were few in number in any case, and had allowed them to be destroyed. He had stood by and allowed his own line of thinking to be wiped out and pilloried before it was fully developed and born. And more recently, while he was still editor-in-chief in Izvestaya and a member of the Politburo, he had accepted as legal the execution of Kamenov and Zinoviev. Neither at the top of his lungs nor even in a whisper had he expressed any indignation over that, and yet these had all been tryouts for his own future role. Way back in the past, when Stalin had threatened to expel him and all the rest of them from the party, Bukharin, like all the rest, had renounced his views in order to remain in the party, and that too had been a tryout for his role. If that was how they acted, while still in freedom and still in the height of honor and power, then they could certainly be depended on to follow the script and to play faultlessly when their body, their food, and their sleep were in the hands of the Lubyanka prompters. And what did Bucharin fear most in those months before his arrest? It is reliably known that above all he feared expulsion from the party, being deprived of the party, being left alive but outside the party. And dear Koba had played magnificently on this trait of his, as he had with them all, from the very moment he had himself become the party. Bucharin, like all the rest of them, did not have his own individual point of view. They didn't have their own genuine ideology of opposition, on the strength of which they could step aside and on which they could take their stand. Before they became an opposition, Stalin declared them to be one, and by this move he rendered them powerless, and all their efforts were directed toward staying in the party, and toward not harming the party at the same time. These added up to too many different obligations for them to be independent. Have a good day, friends.